Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another session of our weekly Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. It is a pleasure to host Professor Niki Akhavan, who is speaking today on From Defense to Intervention, Iran-Iraq War Cinema in a New Millennium. Professor Akhavan is the chair of the Department of Media and Communication Studies at the Catholic University of America. She is the author of Electronic Iran, The Cultural Politics of an Online Evolution, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2013, and has also published on Iranian narrative and documentary cinema, the intersection of Iranian media and gender, information warfare in the age of digital media, and the relationship between Iranian sports and media. In addition to her own research, she's an avid translator. Most recently, she has translated Mohsen Kadivar's Human Rights and Reformist Islam, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2022. Please join me to welcome Professor Akhavan to the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to see everybody here. Thank you, Dr. Tawakkoli Targhi, for inviting me. I want to thank you, as well as all the good folks at University of Toronto, everybody who's involved with the Elahe Omidyar Mir-Djalali lecture series, for inviting me here today. I'm joining you, as you mentioned, from Washington, D.C., which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans and also the neighboring ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Pamunkey peoples. And today I would also like to acknowledge, because I think I would be remiss if I didn't do so, the incredible courage and bravery of the Iranian people, particularly Iranian young girls and women who are out on the streets asking for their basic rights and doing so at grave danger to themselves. My talk today, as you mentioned, is about Iran-Iraq war cinema, with a specific focus on the second decade of the new millennium. And what I'd like to submit to you at the outset of this talk is that my examinations of the Iran-Iraq war cinema in general, but actually this period in particular, tell us a lot about the current state of the Iranian state, the cracks within the state, its attempts to shape national narratives, to use external threats as a means to justify internal repression, and also its increasing inability to convince even those who are historically in its orbit of its preferred narratives. So while my talk is not about contemporary events unfolding at this moment, it does actually set, I think, for us a broader context that's relevant to where we find ourselves today. The Iran-Iraq war, despite having ended more than 34 years ago, it continues to have resonance today. Some of the basic facts of the war continue to be still debated, and it continues to be conjured up for various political agendas, a fact which is reflected in Iranian cinema. The cinema related to the Iran-Iraq war began while the war was raging. It continues to this current day, and it constitutes a vast body of work, some of which is officially recognized in Iran and in the scholarship as its own category or its own genre under the moniker of sacred defense cinema. Sometimes I or others may use the term sacred defense cinema and Iran-Iraq war cinema interchangeably, but they are actually not interchangeable. So not all Iranian war cinema is sacred defense cinema, and not all sacred defense cinema is war cinema, as that category is generally understood in cinema studies or media studies, or even conventionally how war cinema is understood. So in this presentation, I'm concerned with the latter category, the films that have been identified or self-identify as the cinema of sacred defense, which can be defined as a genre that promotes the state's dominant story of the war and the legacy of the war. If we take a cursory look over this 30+ years period of cinematic production, you can detect the representations of the war and the themes related to them, whether it's about the life of veterans, martyrs, themes broadly related to the war. They've shifted in accordance to the political exigencies of any particular moment. There's also shifts in cinematic form. A lot of that can be attributed to developments in media technology and production and post-production techniques, and as well as the development of big studios or studio location spaces for shooting films inside Iran. I'm not going to, lucky for your audience, I'm not going to go into detail about any of those technical developments, but these developments do impact storytelling. They impact how narratives related to the war and sacred defense narratives can be depicted, and in turn, how audiences can be engaged or brought in to the story. Some of the main questions that I've asked in surveying the cinema of sacred defense, and this is still a study in progress, which is why I really appreciate events like this, because I look forward to whatever feedback I get from your audience. The questions are very basic. Who and what is being depicted? How are they being depicted? What's the political and cultural work that's being attempted, which also speaks to who's the audience there? What kind of audience are they reaching out to? But even more importantly, what kind of audiences are they trying to create via this cinema? I was also interested in the critical reception the films are getting inside the country, because that too is indicative of whether or not these films are doing the political work that is intended. For this presentation, I focus on two main works and two main directors. The first film I look at is The Bodyguard, from the veteran filmmaker Ebrahim Hatamikia, who's recognized as a definer of the sacred defense cinema, particularly on the narrative fiction side. This film centers on an Iran-Iraq war veteran who is in the security forces as a bodyguard, though, as we're going to see very shortly, that English term bodyguard is a point of contention in the film, and it's the pivot around which the film makes its main claims. Bodyguard was released in 2016, and it's set around the time that it was released. The second film I'm going to speak about is Standing in the Dust by Mohammad Hossein Mahdavian, who I argue is the newest boundary breaker and boundary maker in defining a new style in sacred defense cinema, both on the documentary and narrative fiction side. Today, I'm going to focus on his narrative fiction work. Standing in the Dust is a biopic of Ahmad Mutawassilian, an IRGC commander who disappeared in Lebanon in 1982. This film, also released in 2016, is obviously not set in the present. So we have one film set in the present about a war veteran made by a veteran filmmaker of sacred defense cinema, and we have one about a soldier set during the war made by a rising star of this cinema. So although these are two very different filmmakers from two different generations, different filmmaking styles, both of them were released in the same year, and very notably, they were both sponsored by the Oj Arts and Media Organization, which is said to have direct links to the IRGC and has been extremely active in funding and supporting a range of media productions since 2013. So some of the media productions or larger mediated campaigns that they've done that folks may be familiar with, goes back to 2013 when they did those big billboards in town depicting Obama as Shem. They took a stance against the nuclear deal with the US. And since then, they really have sponsored a vast amount of works, whether it's films, documentaries, television shows, and even animations directed at children. In a mission statement that's no longer available on their website, OJ notes that its aim is to produce art that promotes revolutionary discourse. It's also often explicitly clear, for example, in the case of the billboards that I was mentioning against the nuclear deal, that the work sponsored by OJ is not only engaging with current social and political development, but it's promoting a particular agenda in the face of these developments, and it's trying to bring in a younger audience. So because of this engagement with current events that's reflected in works that they sponsor, it's very important that I briefly just touch on a few of the events surrounding the time of the release of these two works. So roughly between 2010 and 2014, there were 4 Iranian nuclear scientists who were assassinated and 1 wounded on Iranian soil. December 2010, as most folks now, was also the start of the Arab Spring, starting with Tunisia and spreading across the region. But most notably for Iran, it spread to Syria in March 2011. And Iran itself was in 2010 on the heels of the Iranian Green Movement, which was up to that point the largest anti-government protest in post-revolutionary Iran. When the demonstration started in Syria and Iran became involved soon thereafter, for a long time, they were not open about their involvement. In fact, it was either largely downplayed or straight up denied. However, sometime in May 2013, sources in Iran started using the phrase, quote, "the martyrs protecting the tomb of Zainab," as honorifics for Iranian killed in Syria as part of Iran's involvement in the Syrian civil war. So the emergence of this martyrs label indicated a radical shift because, you know, in the early years of the Syrian conflict, there were reports of soldiers who were killed in Syria secretly being buried in Iran. It's very hush-hush, not acknowledging it. So all of a sudden, there's a shift from not just acknowledging that there's an intervention in Syria, but embracing it and casting it as a defense. And here is where the discourse, the long existing discourse on sacred defense becomes rhetorically useful. You have this existing shell to draw in a new definition of defense that suits the state's contemporary foreign and domestic policies, particularly foreign intervention. So this is the context. So these are the years before these two films, surrounding the time that these two films are released. And now I will turn our attention to talking about the films themselves. I'm going to start with Hatami Kia's Bodyguard. The English word bodyguard is the title of the film, even in Persian. So the Persian version, bodyguard, English version, bodyguard. And that concept is a point of contention from the outset of the film, and it becomes a metaphor for the loss that the film is lamenting. The film has a cold open, and now I will finally turn to my slides. I think you see my slides, correct?
Right.
So the first image, Dr. Tavakkoli said I should put it on the slideshow. Is this better?
Better.
Okay. I think, but what I inadvertently did in doing so is I disappeared. Okay. I disappeared my notes, but now they've reappeared. This is the scene of the cold open. The lead character of the film, Haydar Zabihi, here pictured. He's the hero of the film, played by Parviz Parastui. He's a war veteran. He has shrapnel in his head, and he's at the doctor because he's having issues with his eyes. And as part of the diagnosis of figuring out what's wrong with him, doctors asking him questions, you work at night, et cetera, and he says that he works for the security forces, and the doctor says, "Oh, you're a bodyguard." That's the first slide. And Zabihi says, no, I'm a Mohafiz. Here it says I'm a security man. I should note that here and in all the slides subsequently, please ignore the subtitle translations. I think they're often very bad, so I'm just going to go with my own translation. So there's an emphasis on Muhafiz. And, with this connotations of protection, protector, throughout the film becomes important for understanding this internal struggle that the lead has over his own actions, his own whether or not he stayed faithful to his revolutionary beliefs, but also there's a struggle, an external struggle. There's a struggle between him and the younger generation, his own child, as well as a child of a former fallen comrade. And more importantly, there is a struggle with the state and the authorities. So the film at once depicts a crisis of the protagonist at the same time as it's depicting a crisis of the state. I have to give you the central plot very quickly before I return to the broader examinations. It's essentially this guy, Haydar Zabihi, he's a veteran. He's still suffering psychologically, physically from the war, but he's been in security for high-ranking officials for many years. Very early in the film, there's an assassination attempt on the vice president by an ISIS-type suicide bomber that he's not able to stop. I'm actually going to show you those slides because these are the stills from that initial suicide assassination attempt. This is after the cold open. So there's cold open credits and then the scenes where we see the first assassination. As you can see in these slides, this person who comes in with a note is spotted by Haydar. He shoots him. And there's a moment where you see the suicide, the bomb in his hand, and you think all is well, but then the bomb is detonated, as you can see in the last slide, remotely, and many people are injured and killed. The vice president is injured as well. So after this event, Haydar starts to have some self-doubts about his inability to stop the attack, but then later some authorities also cast doubt on his actions that day. He wants to quit. He ends up reassigned as security for a nuclear scientist who happens to be the son of his comrade who was killed in the Iran-Iraq war. And the movie ends with an assassination attempt on the young scientist, which this time Haydar stops, ultimately sacrificing his life to do so. So the entire film is bookended between these two assassinations. And in this period between these two assassinations, we see many instances where Haydar is ruminating on his role as a security for the state, but also on the state of the state. He understands the role of the security agent as a protector whose actions are rooted in deep belief, unlike a bodyguard for whom it's just a job, it's just transactional. So the centrality of the juxtaposition of a simple bodyguard as opposed to a Muhafiz/protector becomes explicit a little over 25 minutes into the film. This is my next slide here, where he is, sorry, let me just pull down my notes here. Dr. Tavakoli, I see that there's something in the chat. We should.
Yeah, just ignore it right now.
Ignore it for now.
I'll have the questions for later.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is about 25 minutes into the film. This other fellow here is Ashrafi, his immediate boss. And in this scene, Ashrafi is very mad at Haydar because Haydar was supposed to write up like a simple report about what happened on the day of the first assassination. Instead, he wrote this like self-flagellating account of what he did or didn't do. And in this exchange, again, there's two levels of conversations going on. It's about the events of the day, but it's also about everything in the system, as they repeatedly say. And as you can see in this exchange, at one point, he says, Haydar says, we're becoming bodyguards. And his boss says, in this very awkward translation, it says, time needs bodyguards. What he says is, this is the time, this is what the era needs. It's the time of bodyguards. And at which point, Haydar says, bodyguards are mercenaries. There's no belief behind their actions. In other words, Haydar is seeing the state and his supporters, and this is the important point, it's an internal sort of critique, as having been reduced to performative actions for money or for position, where Haydar is brought to answer where without substantive belief or commitment behind any of it. This is again evident late in the film, where Haydar is brought to answer before an internal review for his actions on the day of the assassination. And despite the fact that this immediate supervisor and even the vice president, who was the target of the attack, support him, there's this rogue inspector guy who casts suspicion on Haydar, and who, after the vice president dies of his wounds, brings him in for formal questioning. In a tense exchange, so here is that some scenes from that exchange way late in the film. We're almost towards the end of the film here. I wish I could show you this, but of course I won't, but it's cross-cut with two different scenes. So on the one hand, he's being interviewed, or interrogated rather, by this man in the wheelchair. And that's cross-cut with him getting ready to go to the funeral of the vice president who's died, also cross-cut with scenes from the assassination attempt. So visually, there's a lot going on in this scene. In this scene, again, the inspector is accusing him of using the vice president as a human shield. Haydar's boss becomes really angry at the inspector and at Haydar for not defending himself. And his boss rejects this idea that Haydar used the vice president as human shield, because he says Haydar is from a generation who doesn't know fear. Again, in this conversation, the issue of paid comes up, with the inspector accusing him of being an unbeliever in the system. I mean, this guy in the wheelchair is a holier than thou figure, even more than Haydar, if you could believe that. If you've seen the movie, you know how self-righteous Haydar is. This guy is even more self-righteous than him. And Ashrafi against defends Haydar, and Haydar refuses to defend himself and just says, "I fear the day that this ship gets holes in it." Again, he's talking about the system. He doesn't say your ship sinks, although it's, I guess, close enough. There's a ship in the subtitle as well. But this is an explicit warning about the state of the state and the future of the state. The film concludes with a second assassination attempt, this time on the life of the young scientist. This is that second assassination attempt at the end of the film. Essentially, there's a car bomb placed on the car of the young scientist, who's seen in this third image. Haydar is in his car with his wife. He manages to get that car bomb off the car, in the process flipping over his own car. And as he's getting out the car that's flipped over, he notices that there are two motorcycles coming from the distance. So he runs towards the scientist. The scientist thinks he's coming in for an embrace, but in fact he is using himself as a human shield, and takes the bullets for the young man. And the last words to the young man, the young man's like, "Why did you do this?" And he says, "Your father, would have done the same thing." This scene here, of course, for folks who are familiar with contemporary Iranian developments, that's the car bombings and the motorcycle assassins are the ways that Iranian scientists have been targeted. So again, there are these correlations with on-the-ground events. There are critics of Hatami Kia who say that watching his films is like seeing the same character over and over again. That essentially you're seeing a self-righteous guy internally struggling with questions about what it means to be a true revolutionary, or to, as a soldier, to veteran, whatever the case may be. It's the same guy in his films, but at the end, his films will vindicate that lead character and remind us as the audience, this is what the true revolutionary looks like. Even if we grant this recurrence of the same character in Hatami Kia's films, the expanding realm of tensions for his leads are reflective of an expanding cracks in the revolutionary system. So as you can see, if we traced his films, which I'm not going to do today, there's many of his films, but you can see that, yes, the figures are very similar, but the the realm of conflict is much broader. And so as in this film, it's not just with like a small circle of fellow veterans or a small circle of insiders. It's the state writ large. It's with authorities. It's it's between generations. There's a big intergenerational conflict that you see in these films. So in this film, there is some kind of reconciliation between the generations. I mean, this embrace at the end and this kind of understanding that the scientist gets that of his dad and his dad's generations, because throughout the film, the scientist doesn't really get his dad, like why did his dad sacrifice his life, doesn't really get his dad's generation. So there is this kind of attempt at a reconciliation, but the broader warnings of the film about the cracks in the system and warnings about dangers that face Iran stand until the very end of the film. So I want to now pivot to Standing in the Dust, which, as I indicated at the beginning, is a very different kind of film. Mahdavian's film, which is set in the past and it deals with a figure who's missing in action, presumed dead. That film doesn't have to deal with the realities and contradictions of the present. And as such, it can have an easier time sculpting the ideal soldier. And it also doesn't have a plot really to speak of, because it's a biopic, but it's in pseudo-documentary form. So the director has freed himself from the conventions of both plot-driven narratives and documentary standards. And this brings me back to what I indicated about Mahdavian earlier as well, that at least in terms of formal techniques, Mahdavian has forged new ground in the ways that his work blurs the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, and the ways that the story of sacred defense can be told. Standing in the Dust begins with, there we go. Standing in the Dust starts with two written textual clarifications to the audience. The first one tells us that the actual voice of Mutawassilian is used. So they have recordings of him like from walkie-talkies and other documentary sources. And the second image that we get tells us that none of the images are real in the film. So the film is honest with us at the outset about its constructedness. Nonetheless, the use of Mutawassilian's actual voice, along with a mise-en-scène that carefully recreates the era of the film and the sepia tones that the film is shot in, imbue the images with a documentary feel as well. So it's though, I'm going to show you the pictures now. It's as though we're watching footage from the era and not a recreation of that. So these first two images, you can recognize, at least I can recognize, pictures from the tone of pictures from that era. And the third image, as you can see, is in black and white. When he tells the story of Mutawassilian's childhood, it goes to black and white footage, which again, it reminds the viewer this is constructed, this is not actual documentary, but at the same time, the lines of fiction and fact are constantly being blurred because there are documentary voices that overlay these scenes. These formal elements of the film are used to create an authentic feel, to trigger a sense of nostalgia, not just for those who experienced that era, but also for those who were not born or were too young at the time of the actual events. Mahdavian himself was born in the same year that his film subject disappeared. He was born in 1982. So one can see in this film and in such techniques an attempt to bring in new generations to connect the younger and revolutionary generation, basically using affect to influence a disaffected generation. That's the plan, it seems. These formal techniques for giving the setting an authentic feel also extend to the depiction of the film's hero as well. We see many of the cliche ways that, I mean, if you've seen Iranian sacred defense cinema, there's a lot of sort of black and white depictions of the hero, all good guy, all bad versus all bad guy, which starts to change over time. But you see some of these cliches in this film. I have another screen cap for you here. The first two images on this screen grab are there's a scene where he's giving food to children, and in the second one, he's kissing one of the children he gives food to. The third image, he's actually carrying a dead child from the scenes of battle. And this third screen grab that I have, the scene from which it's taken, it's shot in slow motion, standard fare for emphasizing the heroicness. There's tons of shots of slow motion shots of Mutawassilian throughout the film, including the very last time we see him on screen. So there is all of that. All of those cliches are there. However, we also see negative aspects of his personality in ways that, here's a couple of screenshots again. He fights with his comrades. He's rude to people around him for no apparent reason. He's short-tempered. He's in a bad mood even in happy occasions, like when they're talking about his engagement. This second image, he's literally dragging his comrade in a hospital because he's mad about something that he's done. And so we have these cliches against the backdrop or intercut with him just being an ordinary guy. And there's at least one critic of the film who's noted that this is Mahdavian's sort of trick for making the hero, or his special way. He didn't say trick. He said he's a special way for making the hero believable and acceptable to his audience. In other words, Mahdavian does employ these more showy, these more stage scenes of what revolutionary manhood and heroism looks like, but he also provides antidotes to his own depictions in the form of glimpses to the hero's weaknesses. It kind of softens the audience up to accept the realisticness of his depiction. Mahdavian's soldier is driven by belief. He's not always likable. He's not always rational. He has a commitment to his local community, country, and to a broader religious and ideological fight that extends beyond Iran's borders. And I'm going to return to that in just one second. But again, the film leaves no doubt about his heroism. In this sense, he's very similar to Haydar Zabihi in The Bodyguard. If The Bodyguard is lamenting that type of hero and that type of hero that's dying out, that generation, that special generation that's dying out, or a dying breed of a kind of manhood, Mahdavian is a sketch of that generation at a time when that type of hero was on the rise, at a time when the states, and again, when I say on the rise, I mean within state discourses, specifically, at a time when the state had an easier time making heroes of its fallen and disappeared, and was not internally ridden with strife among the revolutionary ranks, something that we have seen really ramped up post Green Movement era, where families of war martyrs, families from known revolutionary figures, even the family of Mustafa Avini himself, one of the vanguards of sacred defense, basically the haloed name of sacred defense cinema, speak out against the system. So you're sort of dealing in the past, and everything can be presented in its ideal form. Mutawassilian disappeared in Lebanon, but we never see Lebanon in the film. Instead, the last 7 minutes that Mutawassilian is seen on film is actually in Syria. These are 3 screen grabs I have from you. They spend quite a good amount of time. In the first image, it's them boarding the plane, a seatless plane apparently, to Syria. There's a scene at a base in Syria. You can see the Syrian flag. I think it's the only other flag we see in the film, if I'm not mistaken. And the last screen grab I have from you is presumably at it is supposed to be at the Iranian embassy in Syria. So while we see these scenes, there's a voiceover of one of Mutawassilian's contemporaries that tells us that Khomeini had reservations about having forces out in the Levant at a time when Iran's borders were not yet secured. So some of the soldiers came back to Iran, but they didn't want all to come back because they thought that would look like they were chickening out. So some of them decided to stay. There's still some uncertainties about what Mutawassilian thought he was doing in the way that the film tells the story. But in any case, this is the last time we see him in Syria. And the movie ends with a voiceover of Mutawassilian's sisters and brothers. This is sister and the mother are shown in this scene. So you hear sisters and brother talking about how it felt in those days when their brother had first disappeared. But they tell us that eventually they went on with their lives. The brothers and sisters went on with their lives. Their father passed away, but their mother is still waiting, and that nothing has changed for her in terms of her. She's still impacted in the same way. The last image of the film, which I can't screen cap for you, but I have to describe it, is actually just these doors that you're able to see in the second screen grab. It's a very shaky camera with an open door. It's metaphorically like a fluttering, of the heart or some such thing. But the shakiness of an open door. It's a sense of waiting, a sense of worried waiting. That's the last image that we see in the film. So and then we see the last text of the film. This is the way the film ends, with this text that tells us about all that is known of their disappearance, starting with, on July 5th, 1982, Ahmad Mutawassilian was lost somewhere in history. And then it tells us, the story of how their car was stopped by phalangists in Lebanon, and they were taken to a second spot, and then nothing has been heard of them, or nobody knows what happened to them. And they also mentioned that they were supported by that the Lebanese forces there were supported, paramilitary forces were supported by Israel. So it's making all those connections to the region in that last screen text for us. So both the door that's literally left open, the last image we see, and the text leaves things open-ended, a sort of not knowing, but also a sense of unfinished business in the region as a whole. There's unfinished questions, unfinished projects, if you will. And so despite the fact that even the film raises questions of why were they there in the first place, there is this sense that there's this argument in the film, in a sense, that the fate of Iranian revolutionaries was tied from the beginning of the revolution beyond the borders. So again, you can see these connections to the state's current project of intervention beyond its borders, made in a period when the state is both involved in conflicts in the region and internally fractured. I argue that these films can be seen as attempts to suture the past to the present through their central protagonists. They can also be seen as attempts to connect the war generation with those that have come after. The bodyguard's Haydar is a living symbol of dying ideals of the revolution and war, and his death at the end symbolically reconciles two generations, but it does not resolve the problems that the state is facing. Standing in the Dust protagonist, in turn, tries to capture the ideal without the cracks that have become evident in time. Both films show a nation under threat, the bodyguard in the form of threats from terrorists on the border and foreign assassins in the capital, the latter in the midst of a full-blown war. While the films themselves don't explicitly make this argument, we know that the threat of violence by outsiders, whether in the case of Iran-Iraq war or in this exact moment that we're having this conversation, has been central to the state's justifications for its policies, most notably policies of domestic repression, but also involvement in the region. In this sense, both films are reproducing a very familiar state argument. Now, whether and to what extent these films are successful in convincing an audience of their overall messaging is a matter beyond the scope of this talk, but they do indicate a new set of preoccupations in sacred defense cinema that give us insight into the state of the state and its cultural projects at the moment. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Akhavan, an excellent presentation. We already have a question from Susanna Bakowska from Poland, who has joined us, and she's asking how Iranian government uses movies to support the system.
Okay, thank you for that question. Support the system, are we talking in terms of this sort of broader ideological project, I take it. The films of the sacred defense cinema, many of the films in sacred defense cinema, are directly sponsored by state organizations. Now, this by itself is not a determining factor, but the idea is from the very beginning of the war has been, well, not very beginning, because in the early years of the war, many of the films that were made in this period were not following the same kind of ideological line. But one of the things that the Iranian state has done, and which I think is not adequately recognized, is that like all states, they have a repressive arm and they have a productive arm, and that yes, they have a repressive machinery, but there are cultural productions of all sorts that are used to repeat and to shape a particular narrative. And my argument has been that, well, not just my argument, but the argument of many scholars has been to show how the state's policies and vision and dominant narrative about the war has been reflected in these films, and try to draw an audience to identify with the heroes of the war, the heroes that the state has chosen to emphasize.
Very good. Before we go to the next question, I have a follow-up question here. Rather than sort of how the government uses movies, what if we begin to think of Iranian politics as cinematic? That is, state performers, whether it's the supreme leader, the president, all of them, they are sort of movie actors. They are part of a narrative that they want to sell. And in a sense, the politics of the Islamic Republic being a cinematic politics, and very much like Donald Trump's kind of performances, because it's sort of part of a performance, and it's performance conscious and audience conscious.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many instances that can be used to support this reading, and to take that lens metaphorically and put it on the performance of politics. I mean, the famous speech of the Supreme Leader when he, after 2009, when he came on stage and was crying and sort of using his body as a canvas, really, to make his argument. But yes, that is a I don't know if that's really, that's on a whole project. You know, that's right. That's a project that I haven't thought about in those terms, but there is also an argument to be made for how self-aware they might not be good at it, but there's self-awareness about the ways that these state performance can be mediated and remediated, and they try to get ahead of it, whether now in the social media sphere by having their own productions in those spheres, or cinema, or things like, you know, the project of Salam Farmande, and making a performance out of that.
Well, along that line, the recent public appearance of the Supreme Leader seemed so cinematic that all of a sudden he reappears and puts an end to a lot of, you know, discussions of his near-death kind of issues. So focusing on the cinematic Iran, I think politics that's cinematic would be really interesting. But the next question, we have two questions. One by Gunha Kim. Gunha.
Hello, thank you for your great presentation, Professor Akhavan. My name is Gunha Kim, and I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Professor Mohammad Tabakoli. And actually, I have three questions related to each other. So my first question goes with the gender. Since as Professor Tabakoli introduced you, that you also study a relationship between media and gender as well. So do you see any kind of revision in terms of gender relationship of martyrdom in those films? Because I think the same theme is kind of being repeated. Like ordinary men ordinary men like empowering themselves through martyrdom, and women are being audiences. Like this is the very same theme, like from Morteza Avini. Like there are men like who are crying, like weak, but they are like courageous through their act of like martyrdom. And so I'm curious whether those kind of gendered theme remain same or revised. And the other question relates to the enemy, the line between like good and bad. As you said, like good and bad are kind of always clear in those like movies. But in this context, like are enemy or specified, or like for example like United States or Israel, like in like Morteza Avini's like Revayat Fat, like there were like specified goals that should achieve like liberation of Palestine from the hand of like Israel. And then next goal is like United States. Like there was like clear agenda. I'm curious like whether those kind of agendas are still there. And lastly, it's still like one of the theme in like the earlier documentary was the relationship between technology and like human authenticity. So here, in movie like Bodyguard, like the bodyguard doesn't use like any like sophisticated technology to defend like the people. He just uses his own body, and I found that like those are the themes kind of being repeated. And but the thing is that now he should protect scientists, like which has been like the form of something bad, like in those like past, like it was the thing like getting rid of like human authenticity. And now like it's kind of like contradictory that he should like protect those scientists. And I wonder how like political situation or like other like coverage on science, like Professor Tavakoli Tarki had dealt on like engineering of religion. The theme of engineering has been embedded in like political discourses. And can we like interpret like those like science? How can we interpret like the role of technology and science in those films? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are all super excellent questions. To speak to the first one about gender relationships, like absolutely, some of those films on the battleground, there is no room for women because there are no women there, right? And like you said, it's their audiences, their role of waiting at home. But Hatamikia, I think, is one of the first, at least in narrative fiction, to give more of a role to women other than just waiting. So from those kind of early films where even as early from Karka to Rhine, where the sister, the daughter, the mother has a role that's more substantive. Even in this film, like the role that his wife plays in The Bodyguard, or his daughter, it's much more developed. Like the daughter becomes the locus for exchanges about, because she's engaged to, or she has a suitor who's in the same line of work that the father is in, but she's sort of rejecting him because she doesn't want a man like her father, because she doesn't understand that generation. So I think there are developments in the role of women and how gender is or women are in particular are given a more substantive role in these films. Not in Mutavassilian's film. He tries to bring in the sister in Mahdaviyan's film, but again, it's not as because it's focused on him and it's a war story. It's not as central. There are films also that have paid more attention to the role, that are just focused on the role of women. I don't know if you've seen, I think it's called Vilayha. It's about the women who, Do you know that film? It's about families that moved into these villas so that they could be near their husbands and brothers and sons who were in the war, and it's focused on that side of the war effort. And also in Sacred Defense, more broadly, there's a lot of women's memoirs, women's voices. So in that regard, I think there has been a development at the same time that you do see a focus on the male hero. Your second question was about the specifications on whether there's an enemy or not, right? And so if I understood correctly, you were saying initially there is a named enemy, but now it's more ambiguous. I think this speaks to when everybody is seen as an enemy, then, you know, it's hard to, I think it's a one size fits all for them, because there is an emphasis on who, there's an internal enemy, there's an external enemy, and there is a hesitancy to name who that enemy is, because once you name it, you're excluding the other enemies. You want to leave room for interpretation that anybody, you know, all these forces that you named are Iran's enemies, and it's expanding. So that I do agree with you that that's shifted. Even in the Mutavassilion film, it's shifted. Even it's a war about, I mean, it's a film about the war, and you don't hear about Iraq really in the film. So that's really fascinating that you don't do that. I think it gives us leaving room for these other interpretations. And then your question about technology is super fascinating. I would say somebody needs to look at this, because the counter, like on the cinematic side, you're absolutely right. He's just got his body. He's just got like a dinky gun, really, at the end of the day. But in the serialized versions of productions that are also promoted by Oj Foundation, you get something like Gondo, right? That it's ridiculous in terms of the technology. It's not just they have technology, it doesn't even exist. Like they know what's going on in places that you wouldn't even imagine there being surveillance capacities. So I don't know what explains that. I mean, I don't know if that's a Hatami Kia thing, but certainly on the broader state-supported productions, there is an attempt to say, no, we are technologically extremely savvy, so savvy that you've never even heard of, you've imagined our capacities.
Very good, thank you. The next question comes from Professor Golbagh Rekab-Talai, who is also associate editor of Cinema Iranica Digital Compendium. Golbagh.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Akhavan. I really enjoyed the talk, and I really appreciate how you framed your project at first with the moment in 2016 and bringing these films out of that moment, or placing them in that moment in a way. So my question actually goes a little bit further back in time, and I'm wondering about whether you see any connections between films about war, or let's say sacred defense films of the aughts, the early aughts from maybe 2000, I think 2000 to 2009, and their connection to films that kind of appear after 2009, 2010. Do you see any differences in the way the subject is approached? Do you see any differences in, I mean, to be honest with you, the reason I'm asking this question, I was, when you were framing your project, I was thinking about the film Otobus Shab, and its kind of critical view of the war. It's perhaps one of the first ones where we see that there is a little bit of, critical vision of what the war entailed, and you actually see the other side of the story a little bit. So I'm just wondering if we see a transformation from the aughts to the 2010s, and if we do, what does it tell us about the shift from that time to the current period? I have another question, actually. It's just a small question as well. I was wondering if you can comment also on the background of the directors, and if how are they different? I'm just it's really not mind-boggling, but it's just really interesting for me how these two films come from these directors, two very different generations, of course. And I want to know a little bit more about their approach, generational approach, maybe, to the films. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those are really great questions. In fact, when you were talking about the periodization of the films, I mean, this is how I conceived of the project, and you know, the periods that I've divided this project into are really, you know, 2010 to 2016 is one period, 2016, 2017, because I also then see, with the coming of Trump, some changes in the discourse, and but the post 2009 to now I can't even remember my own periodization, but that period that you're talking about, the early aughts, I do agree with you, is a period where we start to see more critical stances on the discourse of the films. And in fact, there are films that get called anti-war and are not screened because even though they're depicting the war, they're asking questions about the war that were until then not, you're not allowed to bring up those questions. What I have to confess to you is that my research in general, because I work on digital cultures, it tends to be, it's a presentist project. I'm always looking at what's happening in the moment, and then I'm looking back to try to explain, what led us to this moment. And so, because I always have that presentist impulse, and I've gained a lot of respect for our historians in this process. In working on this project, I actually am doing it backwards. So I'm starting in the films of the present and then looking at earlier periods. So the early aughts are not, my whole project starts in the 2000s because I think there's a millennial shift, even though of course the Millennium calendar does not match with the Iranian calendar, but certainly a post 9/11 moment. I think post-reform, rise and fall of reform in Iran, I think impacted the kind of cultural productions that were at play. So I can't give you a detailed answer to your question in terms of what the actual difference is, but I certainly do see that there are substantive differences in that period. Yeah, I think that's all I can say.
That's great. Actually, that's very exciting to hear that you're going to go back in time to basically, flesh out those shifts. That's really exciting.
I know that. Thank you. I know that Sholeh Shahrukhi has written about that period. Some of I can't remember the name of her article right now, but I know she talked about, for example, some more attention to the condition of veterans of the war, not in a Hatamikia sort of way, because it's true, Hatamikia brings attention to veterans, but it's still part of the bigger revolutionary project. But there were other works that she cited, I know, that look at, that's more of a critical reflection in terms of what's happened to veterans. That's not part of a bigger project of, but we still need to all support the revolutionary project. Your second question was about the two directors, about the difference between them?
Just the generational difference. I've recently become interested in generational differences, and I'm just wondering how we can see that generational difference in filmmaking between the two films, at least, that you showed us, with one being a war veteran and the other one much younger. Yes. Graduate from Surrey University, for example. I'm curious about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think, to his credit, I think Hatamikia, even though he's been around a long time, is not closed off to experimenting with form. But the thing that I think is really different about Mahdavian is the way that he easily plays around with the barriers of fiction and nonfiction, both in his documentary and non-documentary. Now, your point about intergeneration, I'm really fascinated about that as well, especially given the current moment where, of course, we see so many young people on the street, but there are also older generations who are in camaraderie with them, but also saying, hey, we didn't speak out. Thank you for, being brave in a way that we weren't. There's this parallel universe in the in state cultural production where there's a recognition that, hey, our messaging is falling short. Our messaging is not reaching to the younger generation. In fact, I think I said at the beginning of my talk that I was paying a lot of attention to what film critics inside Iran are saying about these films, and there's over and over again you hear, hey, we can't keep telling the same story using the same forms. So there is a recognition that we want to change the form, and we want the medium will then shift how our message is being impacted. And I think Mahdavian is one of those newer figures who feels like he can play with the technological affordances of various forms of media and create this new form to then reconcile the generations. Because I see both of those films as recognizing a generational gap, more so The Bodyguard.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And I'm sorry that I couldn't turn on my video. I'm not feeling very well today, so I'm not in a state to turn on my camera. My apologies.
Thank you for coming despite not feeling well. And thank you for excellent questions.
Thank you. It was fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you.
Professor Akhavan, we have a couple of other questions. One from Negar. How were the movies you focused on received on the audience side? How the audience reception? And then goes on, the metaphors used in Mahdavian's movies, to what nostalgia the Iranian collective consciousness were they speaking to?
Okay, so the audience reception side, I as a humanist in media studies, that's not something I can do. My only clues to, I don't do reception studies. That's my sort of cop-out answer. But in terms of, there are things that I look at in terms of how many people are. There are figures that you can trace in terms of how many people are watching these films. Are they going on screen? Not just like, are they winning things at the Fajr Film Festival, but how long are they on screen? Even things like how many people are watching it on YouTube and other, because there are some publicly available things that you can find. So on the audience side, I don't have an answer to. My approach is to look at what, it's a very classic sort of media studies approach where you look at the film's argument. What is the text trying to argue, and what are its mechanisms for trying to make connections to the audience? What kind of audience is it trying to engage? I would love it if there were people on the audience studies side who could supplement this work, but that's not just something methodologically that I can do. The second part was, I'm sorry, what was the question about nostalgia?
To what kind of nostalgia and collective Iranian consciousness were they referring to? It's
an attempt to, two different ones, right? So there's an attempt to speak to those who were part of the revolutionary project, who believed in the revolutionary project, who may have since, as The Bodyguard shows, fallen out of, no longer hold a deep belief and are just doing it for performative or position, or they're just disaffected. So it's an attempt to kind of, those people who had bought in at some point, to then reignite that, right? Using those imagery that is familiar to a lot of people. And then the hope to then bring in a new generation who did not live through those experiences, but hoping to create that connection. Now, I recognize in this question, I may be misreading it. There's a very good question that can be also asked in addition to this good question, which is like, whose nostalgia are we talking about? What if you don't relate to any of this stuff? Absolutely. I mean, I think that is why I'm very much, very clear at the beginning that I'm not talking about a general audience that's bought into the revolutionary project or, any of it. It's just about a very concerted effort to bring about, to create nostalgia for some and to reignite it in others who may have had it, not for many others who may have had or have no interest in that project.
Negar, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had my hand up. Sorry,
Please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not turning my camera on. I'm also not feeling quite well, so sorry about that. Yeah, my question basically the second question basically refers to what you just brilliantly mentioned. And yeah, I was thinking about, are they like crafting a sort of nostalgia for people? Yeah, we might not have some picture that they are sort of assembling for us, screening for us. And then by viewing that image on the screen, we may model it and mimic it in our lives. So yeah, that was my point.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And, there's literature in other areas as well, like people who talked about war cinema in general. Well, there's like World War II cinema in the US or, European cinema, that there are these, those kind of battleground films or war cinema are recognized vehicles for trying to bring about a kind of continuity of past and present and to bring in audiences into a bigger narrative. But absolutely, I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that this is going to be a nostalgic for, not everybody's buying into this project clearly, nor had they all along, but that it's a very specific project. So thank you for your question.
Very
Thank you
good.
so much.
Alejandra, do you want to ask your question? Alejandra has a question, so that the shift from when the enemy is external to an era where the enemy external and within.
Yes. When did that shift happen? Is that the
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
I mean, I really see it in like post 2010s. And again, I think somebody was, there's another question about, which I just sort of saw out of the corner of my eye, about Khatamikia in general, which makes me think of it's 2018 film that he made, which is about, Be Vakht Damishq. So it all takes place in, it's about, pilots that get lost in or felled in Damascus. And so that's an example where explicitly the threat and the intervention is justified and is placed outside the borders, but they're always playing with the internal external threat, even in television series, and I really think it's a post Arab Spring or post Green Movement phenomena. But I'm not saying that with complete conviction, because I really would have to go trace that in the cinema, in broader social media discourses, with which I am much more familiar. That's when I see that shift.
And can I ask a follow-up question? If there is a decisive shift from external enemy to the external enemy and internal agents of the external enemy, which of these movie making that is supported by the states propagates state ideology are more repressive?
Probably the former, the one that sees the agents from within. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think the former, because the former becomes a shell for then distrusting your fellow compatriots, but also for justifying all kinds of surveillance and arrest now, ask questions later. So I think in terms of internal control, that's much, if you're looking at it as a tool of repression for the state, that would be the one, because the external threat is still abstract. For most Iranians, it's still abstract. And even those who have memories or who lived through the Iran-Iraq War, that just seems so distant. So I think they have to do a lot more convincing. And even if there is this external threat, the question is, well, then what, fine, there's this external threat. Why are you repressing my personal freedoms? Whereas if the threat is within, there's agents, you might be assassinated, or our scientists are being assassinated, then that becomes justification for surveillance and other forms of control. So I think that one is more repressive.
Right. Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, please join me to thank Professor Akhavan for her outstanding presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Have a nice afternoon, everyone, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Have a nice weekend. Khodafez.
Likewise.